Hey, Internet, meet the OnePlus 2. So this device is a successor to last year's phone, the OnePlus 1, and there's been a lot of hype around it. I got to spend some quality time with it. It was my daily driver for about 3.5 to 4 weeks, which is a pretty long time. And I noticed a couple of interesting things about it. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. The best place to start with this device is with the build. And it's basically got this rectangular or boxy feel to it. It's not the prettiest looking smartphone out there, but it feels great in the hand, which is what counts. It's also a bit on the heavier side as far as smartphones go. And it's also a bit taller than your usual smartphones because of that chin and forehead. But it's definitely not the largest 5.5-inch screen smartphone out there. So the build is pretty similar to the OnePlus 1's build, except this time, all around the sides of the phone, you've got this metal band. And it's this metal band alone that gives this phone a really premium feel, and it's a huge improvement over the OnePlus 1. At the back of the phone, you've got that sandstone black back again. So with the OnePlus 1, this used to be an optional choice. You could either choose the white variant or the sandstone black variant. But this year round, every OnePlus 2 ships by default with this sandstone black back. And because it's removable, you can switch it out for another back. So if you don't really like the sandstone black back, you can go with a wood back or the white back or even a Kevlar back. And underneath the backplate, you've got your 2 nano SIM card trays, but there's no micro SD card slot here, so no expandable storage, but you do get just the 2 SIM card trays. On the left-hand side of the phone, you've got the alert slider, which is actually a pretty neat feature. It works kind of like Apple's mute switch, except this one's got 3 modes. So there's priority mode, no notifications, and all notifications. So with this alert slider, all the way up is no interruptions, in the middle is priority mode, and all the way down is all notifications. I figure you've probably already heard this before, but it kind of feels like the alert slider is on in reverse. I think I'd rather go all the way up for all notifications and all the way down for no notifications. I mean, you get used to it after a bit, but it's something that struck me. The buttons are really tactile, but button placement isn't so great. I still constantly keep hitting the volume down key instead of the power button, and this is probably because neither of the buttons are ridged, so you can't tell them apart. But it turns out, after the first couple of days, I didn't really hit the power button all that much, because there's always double tap to wake, which, by the way, is probably the most underrated feature of this smartphone. But anyway, the headphone jack's up at the top, which isn't really the best place for me. I'd rather it be on the bottom, but personal preference, I guess. And the bottom has 2 things, the USB Type-C port, which we'll get to in a second, and the speaker. The speaker isn't good at all. I mean, it's not stereo, it's not very loud, and it's really easy to block accidentally when you're watching a video or something. I mean, you can mess with the EQ, and you can switch between a few EQs, actually, but honestly, the quality of the driver has to be good before you try and mess with the EQ to get better sound. USB Type-C is a whole new deal. So it's definitely the future, like OnePlus says it is, but it's also a bit of an inconvenience. I mean, think about it. How many people do you know with USB Type-C devices or chargers? 1? 2? 3? Yeah, probably somewhere around 0. So what that essentially means is that in case the charge gets to about 10 or 15% and you don't happen to have your charger with you, chances are the battery's going to die because you're not going to be able to find a charger for this thing that easily. Coming back to the front of this device for just a second, there's that big, beautiful 5.5-inch 1080p LCD screen. And I think OnePlus has nailed it with this screen. I mean, it can produce some really deep blacks, but also some really bright whites, which is fantastic. I go as far as saying this is one of the best, if not the best, 1080p screen smartphone out there in the market today. And then there's the fingerprint sensor. Now, a couple of things about this fingerprint sensor. Number 1, it is really, really fast. And number 2, it works even when the display is off. So combining those 2 things, I can go from display off to phone unlocked without visiting the lock screen in under a second. And if that's not cool, I don't know what is. But I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with the fingerprint sensor. For example, sometimes it doesn't even let me into the device because it didn't scan my fingerprint correctly. And this gets really annoying because it means I have to make like a second or a third attempt at unlocking the phone. But I'm going to count this as nitpicking because it doesn't happen every single time, and it could probably be fixed with a software update. Fun fact, that fingerprint sensor / home button, yeah, that's not a physical key, so you can't exactly press down on it. It doesn't click. It's just a glass surface, so you can only tap. And speaking of software, we get to probably the best part of the OnePlus 2, So the OnePlus 2 runs Oxygen OS 2.0.1, which is basically like a super customizable version of stock Android. And I gotta say, I really like it. It's fluid, it's clean, and you can make it feel exactly how you want it to. You can choose between off-screen and on-screen navigation buttons. I chose off-screen because that way you can just use more of the screen. You can even swap the order of the recent and back buttons, and you can choose what a long press and a double tap of the home button or the recents button or pretty much every button on the phone does. That's how I got the long press to open the search assistant and the double tap to open the camera. You can rearrange the toggles in quick settings to make some icons more reachable and remove ones you don't really use. You can mess with the number of icons on each page of the app drawer to make it feel more spacious, or just because you want to. So there's tons of this kind of stuff. You can go into SIM card settings and use one SIM for calls and one SIM for data, or make one of them your preferred SIM, or really just however you want. And if you really don't like the color scheme, you can even go into settings, enable a system-wide dark theme, and change the accent colors, which is actually pretty neat. There are also a whole ton of gestures you can use. So there's obviously double tap to wake. You can draw a V to toggle the flashlight, which actually went off a couple of times in my pocket, so I switched it off. And you can even draw an O to open the camera. And if you really want to, you can even mess with the LED notification colors. But yeah, overall performance is top notch. I did loads of web browsing, I gamed plenty, and I watched a whole ton of videos, and the processor still held up pretty well. It didn't overheat, and it didn't lag on me either, so it stayed pretty fluid. And speaking of the processor, there were a couple of concerns that the Snapdragon 810, which is what's inside the OnePlus 2, tends to overheat a bit during heavy usage. I never noticed any overheating during heavy usage, but while it was charging, I did notice that the top left part of the metal band tended to get a bit hot. It wasn't to the point where you couldn't touch it or anything, but it still got a little warm. So there's obviously not a whole lot wrong with this device. But one of the things it did manage to get wrong could be a deal breaker for some people, and that's not having NFC. And I say for some people because for most people, not having NFC isn't going to be a huge deal. Now, for people like me who barely use NFC and use it occasionally to like transfer photos between two devices, it's not going to be a huge problem. But I know there are people out there who use NFC all the time for like mobile payments and Google Wallet and transferring data between two phones. And for those kind of people, this is going to be a huge deal. It's actually a bit surprising that OnePlus didn't include NFC in here. I mean, just because very few people use NFC doesn't mean you don't include it at all in the device. And I know they're trying to reach that magical price point of less than $400, but here's the thing. NFC chips are like dirt cheap these days, like to the point where I can go on Amazon right now and get a pack for under $10. That means it costs manufacturers even less. So it wouldn't have cost them a fortune to put it in there. When it comes to the battery life, the OnePlus 2 is okay. So I'd get between 4 to 4.5 hours of screen on time, and the battery would hold out for about a day. It never really died on me or anything, and I'd usually end the day with about 15 to 20% left, but it was only just enough to pull me through the day, and nothing more than that. Standby time was also not all that great. I mean, if you forget to charge it overnight, you lose about 15% of your battery. And that's still a huge improvement over the Moto X 2014, which is what I'm coming from, but there's still a long way to go. And there's also no dedicated power saving mode, so in case the battery falls below 10%, you're probably just going to switch it off. Another thing about the battery is that there's no fast charging. Well, I guess this also kind of ties into USB Type-C. But yeah, there's no fast charging or wireless charging. I actually have two things to say about this. Number one is that they're cutting corners to get you a phone at this price, and this is just one of the ways they did that. And number two is that I didn't really notice the need for either of them. As for fast charging, like I said, I made it through an entire day without needing to plug it in, so I never really noticed it. And as for wireless charging, the same logic kind of applies. I'd only plug it in at night when I went to sleep, so I didn't really notice that fast charging was missing or wireless charging was missing. So next up is the camera, and to be honest, it's actually got a pretty good camera, and it has the potential to be an excellent camera if it continues to get these software updates. I mean, it's nowhere near the photo quality of the Galaxy S6 or the LG G4, but you gotta remember, you're working on a budget here, so they've cut some corners here and there. But before I get into that, let me tell you a bit about the hardware. So the OnePlus 2 is rocking a 13 megapixel camera with laser autofocus, optical image stabilization, and an f2.0 lens. So laser autofocus is super fast, as it should be. Optical image stabilization, not so great. At first I actually thought that there wasn't any optical image stabilization until I realized that it's just not really doing a good job. And then there's the pixels. So the OnePlus 2 has actually got a large pixel size, so that leads to some pretty clean shots. The f2.0 isn't really the fastest. It's not as fast as an f1.9 or an f1.8, obviously, but it does the job pretty well. But there are a couple of things wrong with the camera. So for starters, it's a bit slow when it comes to actually taking the shot, and it's prominent in low light conditions. It kind of takes a second or two to actually capture the image, and that causes so many problems. For example, a couple of times I just assume that it's taken the shot already, and I move forward, and then I hear the click, so I go back into photos, and I notice that it's taken this crappy, blurry shot, which is kind of discouraging when you're taking pictures of fast motion, and you can't exactly redo the picture. And it's not like this happens occasionally. It's slow every single time. It's a little faster with better light conditions, but it still really needs to be improved. But the shots themselves weren't all that bad. The photos were sharp when there's plenty of light, and the colors were actually pretty accurate, and the contrast is surprisingly good. So when it comes to shooting modes, you actually have a couple of different types built into the camera software. There's Auto, Beauty, HDR, and Clear Shot. Beauty just makes the skin a whole lot softer when you're taking someone's picture. HDR adds a lot of saturation and brightens up the shadows a bit. And Clear Shot is a function I'm not really sure about, because at first glance it seems to be pretty much the same as the pictures I took in Auto. But when you zoom in, you can see the slight differences in detail. It's a little sharper and even a little brighter. So for reference, here's a picture in Auto mode. Here's one with HDR, and here's one with Clear Shot. Again, Auto, HDR, Clear Shot. So you can actually see the differences between HDR and the other two, but you can't really notice the difference between Clear Shot and Auto, at least not to the naked eye. Low light shooting wasn't all that bad. Besides the whole deal with the image being captured nearly like a second later, it actually works without a hitch. So it retains most of the color accuracy and the saturation. Sharpness dips a bit, but really you can make up for most of this with the insanely powerful flash. The flash really managed to brighten up most of my pictures. You can actually see here in this picture what a massive difference that flash made. So yeah, props to OnePlus for the awesome flash. So yeah, in a nutshell, this is a great phone. If you can live without fast charging or NFC or wireless charging, then this could be the device for you. And if you can overlook all that, then your only problem is, once again, getting your hands on an invite. Either way, that's been it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. And subscribe, because the OnePlus X is in the house, and the review will probably be out pretty soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Ciao.